Hello, and welcome to Evenings with an Author at the American Library in Paris. My name is Emily Biggs, and I'm the Programs Manager here at the library. Is anyone here tonight for the first time? That's a good number of hands. That's sufficient. I can give you our spiel then. We have been in operation for over 100 years. We are the largest English language lending library on the European continent. And in our time of operation, we've been the intellectual home to figures such as Ernest Hemingway, Gertrude Stein, Edith Wharton, and we remain a cultural center today, hosting brilliant authors, journalists, filmmakers, etc., 2 to 3 times per week. So I highly encourage you to take a quick look at our collections on your way out and to check out our program's calendar to see what other events are coming up. Just a couple of notes about this conversation. After about 45 minutes, we are going to open it up to questions from our in-person audience, and if we have time, from our Zoom audience as well. And copies of the book, which is about to be discussed, are available for sale, thanks to our partner, booksellers Smith & Son. You might even get it signed after the event if Benjamin is feeling kind. So I highly encourage you to purchase a copy, and this event will be followed by a catered reception, which has been very generously sponsored by library trustee Steve and Barbara Gerber. So thank you very much, Steve and Barbara, for your support tonight. It's an opportunity for everyone to have a nibble, have a drink, and speak about the sort of art that we're going to learn about tonight. On to our brilliant speakers tonight. It is such a privilege, such a pleasure to be joined by Benjamin Moser in conversation with Pamela Druckerman as they discuss the upside-down world, meetings with the Dutch masters. Benjamin Moser is the author of Why This World, a biography of Clarice Lispector, which was a finalist for the National Books Critics Circle Award and a New York Times Notable Book of 2009. He's also the author of Sontag, Her Life and Work. For his work bringing Clarice Lispector to international prominence, including through publishing her complete works in English, he received Brazil's first state prize for cultural diplomacy. And for Sontag, Her Life and Work, he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in biography. His latest book, which we are discussing tonight, The Upside-Down World, Meetings with the Dutch Masters, was published in October 2023, and he lives in the Netherlands and France. And joining Benjamin tonight is the brilliant Pamela Druckerman, who many of you may know already as she's spoken at the library before. Pamela is a journalist and author of 5 books, including Bringing Up Bebe, which has been translated into 31 languages. She won an Emmy for The Forger, a New York Times documentary about a French teenager in World War II. Her op-eds, essays, articles, and reviews have been published in the New York Times, The Economist, The Atlantic, Le Monde, and many other publications. And the book which we are going to be exploring tonight, The Upside-Down World, is a meditation upon what art is, what it can do, what it can say, what it can teach us to see in the world, and also how we can use it to imagine new worlds. And more than that, it's a book about being abroad, which I think is something that's quite meaningful for all of us, a book about learning to be at home in the sort of not at-home spaces and learning to be more broadly. So it's such a pleasure tonight to be joined by Benjamin and Pamela, and going on this artistic journey with both of you. Thank you so much for joining us. Can we have a round of applause?
Thank you so much, Emily. So I have a plan for tonight because we don't have a lot of time, and it's a vast and wonderful book. And I'm saying that not because you're my dear friend, but because I truly, truly loved it. So my plan is 3 parts. First, we talk a little bit about how you got to the Netherlands and discover Dutch art. Part 2 is a kind of speed dating trip through the Dutch masters. We'll decide which one we want to bring home. And part 3 is reflections on being an American abroad. And I will try to do all this very swiftly because as I said, we don't have a lot of time. To open up, I have known you for a long time, Benjamin. But I did not know that you had an early encounter with Dutch art before you knew you were moving to the Netherlands. Could you tell us quickly about that?
I did. I mean, I had more encounters with Dutch art because in our country we have a lot of Dutch art for reasons related to national pride and mainly anti-English sentiment. There's huge collections of Dutch art because our greatest city was, of course, New Amsterdam and not New England, and so in New York particularly there's a whole tradition of Americans collecting Dutch art as a patriotic move. But when I came out of college in 1998, and I moved to New York, and I was really done with college. I mean, I felt like, okay, that was nice. I'm glad to be an educated person, and now it's time to move on and like get a real life. And but I wanted to keep learning, and I didn't know how to. I mean, you can go to stuff, but it's not the same where in college they say, okay, this is Dutch art. Everybody sit down. You've got 5 months. We're going to tell you what's what, and then you know something, if you're lucky. And so I would just I went to every art exhibition that I could find in New York, and I went out to Connecticut one weekend with my sister, and we saw an exhibition of Pieter de Hoogh in Hartford, Connecticut, in the Wadsworth Atheneum, which is, I think, the oldest public museum in the United States. And Pieter de Hoogh is this painter of the happy home, and he paints cute kids and little dogs and mothers, and it is a very loving, warm subject matter, and it's placed in these very beautiful, warm homes, Dutch homes.
Are you saying you didn't come from a happy home like that?
I came from I came from, a subdivision of Houston, and so no, it was very ideal, and I think that at the time I was maybe looking for a home in a sense, because I had just come out of school. I had just come off this path. And the great thing about being in school and being a kid, it's also very oppressive in a lot of cases, but you know that after 7th grade is 8th grade, and that after 8th grade is 9th grade, and after 9th grade is 10th grade, and suddenly you've got 60 years ahead of you if you're lucky. Right. And what's that going to look like? It's kind of a scary time. So I kind of idealized those Dutch houses, and then very shortly afterwards.
Yeah, I was hoping we could discuss the meet cute with the Dutch partner, if you're comfortable talking about that.
Yeah. Well, so I had a job in publishing in New York. I was an editorial assistant at Knopf, which was very fascinating. I always read books, and actually my mother was a bookseller. She had a bookstore, and so I knew what books were. I thought I knew a lot about books, but then you realize how totally different it is to go from a manuscript on your computer to a book in a bookstore. And that's what you learn when you work in publishing. And it was completely fascinating. And you got to call all these very famous people by their first names. Like I got to call V.S. Naipaul Vidya, which I thought was really cool and also completely inappropriate. I don't know what he thought about that. I mean, and I had, it's fun. You get to meet people from all over the world. And one fine day, this Dutch author walked into the office, and I had read his book the night before, and I thought it was a fantastically good book, and I thought he was really good looking. And I thought, okay, maybe I'm going to go to this lunch with my boss. And I sort of invited myself along to this lunch. Anyway, so now that's been more than half my life ago that we've been together.
So you found yourself as a 25-year-old suddenly living in the Netherlands, which sounds like a friendly English-speaking country, but I imagine was not the most accessible place.
It looks like it. Far more than France, I would say. Far more than Italy or Germany. It feels sort of like it looks kind of, it's different because the architecture is different, but the people aren't that different. The people kind of look like Americans even. You could easily confuse them. And you realize, I realized at least, how I quickly realized that I was really in over my head, and I was in a completely foreign place that was all the more foreign because it didn't even look foreign. Yeah. It didn't feel foreign.
Yeah, but I should say that Ben, you can't really tell right now, but is a master of languages and very quickly learned perfect Dutch. And my husband is Dutch and says Ben's Dutch is as good as his is. But nonetheless, it was alienating to be there. And you write about discovering Dutch museums. And I love the way you put it. You talk about the thrill of finding oneself in a room packed with old and mysterious things. My discovery of these rooms was one of the revelations of my life. It had a strange effect on me. I discovered that I could walk through these rooms the way I might walk through a cathedral or a forest, and that I would emerge from them the way I emerged from a good night's sleep or a long jog, calmer, happier, more focused. And I felt there was something here I needed to know. I didn't know what. I didn't know that there are places you visit. I did know there are places you visit and are happy to have seen but never need to see again. I did know that there are people you enjoy meeting and enjoy spending an evening with and whom, with no hard feelings, you never need to see again. And I knew that there are places and people that get under your skin. You want to know everything about them. They make you fall in love. That is how I felt about Dutch art. So that is how you found the Netherlands, your way into the place.
Well, because, you know, you can go into a new culture in all sorts of different ways. I mean, you can be interested in music. You can be interested in sports. You can be interested in, I mean, you know, a person. You fall in love with a foreign person, and suddenly you learn about Greece because you fall in love with someone Greek. I mean, this is there's all these ways, and those museums are so incredible. And again, you know, we have a lot of Dutch art in the United States. There's a lot of it here in Paris. There's a lot of it in Germany. There's a lot of it in England. The Dutch exported their art by the millions and millions of paintings. It was often made for export. But when you actually go into those places and you see that often it does hang actually in the places that it was intended, it was made for 400 or 500 years ago, and it's still there. There's something about it, and I think also that painting is the great art of the Dutch in the way that, I mean, you could say that like theater is the great art of the English. That if you really want to know England, you go to Shakespeare, and then all of everything that comes out of that. And in Holland, I mean, I think it's an unbelievable tradition, and I loved it. I mean, I loved it. It was weird. It wasn't just like you go to something and you think, oh, you know, that's nice, it's interesting. But like it kind of made me high.
Well, you mentioned that, so you're a 25-year-old newly in love in this new country, trying to figure it out, lonely, in love but terribly lonely, away from everything you knew. And you write in the book that it seemed that these Dutch painters were asking the same questions about the world and about life that you were.
That was what was really weird, because I think when you're starting out as a writer or as any kind of artist or musician or, you know, whatever, you're so aware of how much you don't know and how inexperienced you are and how much better everybody else is and how much more successful and how much prettier and how much better. And it was a huge comfort to discover that a lot of these incredibly famous masters were actually really terrible at certain points in their careers. And like, I remember the moment when I figured out that Vermeer had painted, like, it's not that many. He didn't paint that many pictures as far as we know, but there's like 3 or 4 really ugly Vermeers. And I felt so happy to know that, because I thought suddenly I could imagine this person as somebody like me, you know, somebody, I mean, Vermeer dies at 43. So, you know, this was somebody who is also like this 20-year-old kid who doesn't know his ass from his elbow and who's just like sitting there in this room. And as it happened, I lived in a house that looks a lot like any sort of, it's a house from 1600. So it really looks like a house from a Dutch painting. And thinking, okay, well, they found the courage somehow, or the desperation, or the, you know.
Sitting in the same rooms.
Sitting in the same rooms, and they were in the same, that same moment of a young person starting out in the world. Yeah. And I found that incredibly comforting.
Yeah. Fortunately, you didn't have 12 children at that point, as all of the Dutch masters.
That was later, yeah.
But it was actually a very different moment. We're in the 17th century when all these artists that you write about live. Can you set up the moment for us? What was it like? What was the sort of point in time that they were? How is it that there were so many incredible artists that came out of such a tiny country in such a small span of time?
Well, this happens, you know, in some moments historically. You know that in Florence in 1482, there's all these geniuses just walking around the street. There wasn't. They weren't there 3 years before. They weren't there 3 years after. They just. It happens in Athens. It happens in a few places. And the Dutch Golden Age is basically. It's the time from the end of the 16th century when the Dutch start this incredibly brutal war to free themselves from the Spanish Catholic monarchy and set themselves up as an independent nation. And they're a crappy nation. You know, they're nothing. They're like, it's 1 million people at the height of its power. It's nothing. And they fight this incredibly heroic war that was a war that was fought for all of us. I think even today, it was a war against absolutism. It was a war against tyranny. It was a war against unfreedom. And they won almost miraculously at the same time that their religion was thoroughly reformed, which means for the art world, it means basically the Taliban. So you see these pictures of these Dutch churches, they're all white and they're all clean and painted. Well, if you read the descriptions of the iconoclasms of the late 16th century, these were unbelievably violent. I mean, this was like, it's an unbelievably brutal moment in all of Flanders and all of the Netherlands. And so basically there's no art. I mean, there's something, but these, people need more stuff, and they need to invent more stuff, because the old models that they had they're not exactly completely bankrupt, but you don't have any religious art really, because the churches aren't commissioning that religious art. And so suddenly you have this way of looking at the world, and that they didn't invent all of it, but they invented a lot of it: landscapes, still lifes, portraiture, portraits of regular people walking down the street, all of this stuff. The de Hoog kind of pictures of a mother and a child. That's not a motif that you would have had in Italian art or even in French art, unless it was from the part of France that touches the north.
Right. Well, let's start talking about some of these artists in particular. And of course, we want to start with the father of it all, is Rembrandt. What did he invent exactly? Well,
so Rembrandt, first of all, invents what we would maybe make the distinction between religious and spiritual art. Rembrandt invents spiritual subjects for a Protestant society, and he does it in a way that's so incredibly moving. I was just at the Mauritshuis 3 days ago, something like that, seeing his famous painting of David and Saul, and Saul is, David is playing the harp to try to calm down the angry old king. And these are these kind of extremely heavily emotional paintings that often, happens to be a king because Rembrandt liked costumes, but they're often just normal people's, and they create emotions that really, it's similar to Shakespeare. I mean, he's a little bit after Shakespeare. He's 10, I guess, when Shakespeare dies, but in the same way that he creates these incredible dramas. And often, as I write in the book, they're quite agonizing to look at. I mean, this is something that you would never have for mere painting. Like here, down the street, you can see Le Bœuf écorché, which is a incredibly horrifying picture of a dead animal. You see all these religious paintings. It's very heavy when you put it together.
If I could quote you to yourself on Rembrandt, looking at his pictures is sometimes unbearable. There are more scenes of murder, cruelty, torture, rape, betrayal, malediction, and death in Rembrandt than in any other Dutch painter's work by far. But you also say that there's a lightness to them. You say their patina, their glow, the sense that they give of something physical, like an extraordinary geological phenomenon. So they have this kind of dual quality. You're like, I got that.
Because Rembrandts are beautiful paintings. I mean, they're absolutely beautiful. And also, I have to say, this is also me. It's the first chapter in the book, but it's the last chapter I wrote, because I was really intimidated by writing anything about Rembrandt. And there's so much written about it. I have a friend who's an art dealer in Amsterdam who has a whole room, probably this size, and it's just books about Rembrandt. Wow. And so you think, here, I'm going to add my little thoughts to this thing. But actually, I found that nobody had really written about that emotional quality of it.
Well, you say also that Vermeer was the painter of light and Rembrandt was the painter of darkness. Well, he had this sort of dual quality, but his paintings are so dark.
Well, it's dark mixed with light. So, Vermeer doesn't really have that much darkness. There's not really any, it's not it doesn't make your stomach churn to look at a Vermeer, as it often does to look at a Rembrandt, but the light is always halfway. And so, as in Shakespeare, even the most gruesome Shakespearean tyrants are kind of sympa, in a certain way. I mean, if you get them, they're understandable. They have motivations. They have a full character. You understand why they're doing these things, which is a very modern thing. I mean, that's, in medieval literature, you have more clearly heroic people. Rembrandt's not. It's never as clear. And he also himself had a very complex personality.
Yeah, I was going to say, first of all, Rembrandt himself was extremely famous in his lifetime. He was the grand sort of don of the community, right?
Well, I mean, he had paintings commissioned from as far away as Sicily.
Ooh.
So, he was, and from the time he was very young, visiting potentates would come visit his studio, and he was, and he's actually the only one of two Dutch painters, that was always famous. Never had to be rediscovered. Usually it's in 19th century, and usually here in France, the Dutch painters were rediscovered by French critics.
Yeah. We also know quite a bit compared to a lot of the other painters about his life, partly because he was so disliked by everyone around him. What was he like?
Well, okay, so this is something I always have to say. Last week or 2 weeks ago, I was in Haarlem in the Netherlands, and I got to see, it was for a TV thing in Germany, for Arte, which you also have here, so I guess it'll be on here. They brought out all of the Frans Hals archive pieces. So there's absolutely nothing known about Frans Hals, except he got sued for butter, and he got sued for cheese, and he got sued 3 times by the baker, and he had all these children. But, so they bring him out, and of course, I can't read this. It's 17th century handwriting. It's very hard to read. And actually, they told us, oh, it's here. So I sat there, and I was like, oh, look. Of course, they pointed out exactly where I was supposed to look surprised and fascinated. But that's the case for most of these painters, is you have almost nothing.
Right.
And Rembrandt, he was frequently disliked and frequently sued. But also, even Rembrandt, for example, we only have 7 letters by Rembrandt, which is actually more than you have for a lot of these painters. And they're mostly like, thank you so much for taking me to lunch. You get nothing. And but you still, because
So how do we have so many books about him?
Oh, it's all just people have pulled it out of their ass. I mean, really, you don't have that much. I mean, look at Shakespeare, actually, just to compare Rembrandt and Shakespeare one more time, but that's why there's this idea that Shakespeare might not have existed, or maybe he was a woman, or maybe he lived down the street or something, because actually the documentation is so sparse. But Rembrandt, there is actually more than for most of them.
Okay. And Rembrandt was extremely famous, but then he died poor in the Jordan neighborhood. Sort of, did he fall out of favor? Is that what happened?
Well, he spent a lot of money, first of all. He had a fabulous collection, which you can see in the Rembrandt house in Amsterdam. If you ever go visit it, the house is preserved. And because it all got auctioned off, we know actually everything that was in his house, which is kind of cool. You have a pretty complete inventory of his books and his weird skeletons of crocodiles, and he collected stuff, and you see a lot of it in the paintings. No, I mean, he fell out of favor in a certain way. He was an incredibly obstreperous person. And this is actually why in the 19th century he gets revived as a romantic hero, because the Byronic creator who wrests the fire off of Olympus, that figure, that is Rembrandt more than any other figure. And so in the 19th century, he was more
kind of rehabilitated,
sortable, than a lot of the others, who were seen as they were social climbers, or they were just trying to go along with fashion.
Right. Well, speaking of people who are going along with fashion, the second person I wanted to talk to you about, there are a lot of artists in the book, and we're not going to get to all of them, is Lievens, who was a contemporary of Rembrandt, and who was also famous in his lifetime. He was a celebrity right by the time he was 12 years old. But you kind of, I'm not sure you come out and say this, but you kind of paint him as a sort of Salieri who was jealous of Rembrandt, or maybe you actually do come out and say that.
Well, I don't say Salieri, but it is sort of, I mean, yes.
Yeah.
Lievens was seen as a young man, and they grew up in the same neighborhood in Leiden, and they shared a studio supposedly together. They painted the same things. This is, in their teenage years. And Lievens never kind of gets off the ground. And I think that for me, he does, I say in that same part, he paints the Prince of Orange, he paints the Prince of Wales, he paints the King of France, he paints he's not a total loser.
Right.
But when we look at it now, we see it's vastly inferior and obviously inferior to Rembrandt.
Yeah. Well, you make a very interesting point in your section on Lievens. You say that prodigies are recognized as such because they copy their elders, but they don't have that quality of innovation.
This is the thing about prodigies, is that the way that you get ahead as a young person, especially when you're 12 years old, is by finding favor with people who are ahead of you. And so you kind of do what they do and you imitate it. And so you become a mimic.
Yeah.
And, but I at the same time, I have tenderness for Lievens because, you know, a lot of these things like that I'm writing about and thinking about, I started writing about and thinking about as a young person who was trying to, I was like, you know, what am I supposed to do? Like, it's a very, like, is it okay to imitate people? Do you have to be original? Do you have to, you know, we have this whole kind of ideology of originality in art, which, you know, I mean, go to the François Pinault, you know, all this kind of stuff. You like, think, no offense if he's joined us tonight, but you know, there's a kind of like,
it's too original.
I know, it's too original. No, but there's a kind of originality that's just for the sake of originality, and that's actually, you know, in the old days, you would go to the Académie Julian or whatever, and you would learn how to like imitate sculptures. You would learn how to paint nudes. You would know, and there was a proper way to do things. And I think that I think there's something to be said for that.
Yeah, and in this period, they were all apprenticing to each other. You know, apprenticed to each other. You were.
That's the only
very
way.
Much in a school, yeah. I mean, in writing too, I think you kind of find your style through imitating the people, imperfectly imitating the people that you like.
Well, and you know, you were talking about Hemingway. That's like the great example of, I think, an older generation. Like everybody tried to imitate Hemingway. They thought, oh, well, this is really easy. You just don't use any adjectives. Okay, like, you know, there's all these shortcuts in art that you think, oh, okay, I'm just gonna have really short sentences, and you realize, fine, it's good to experiment, but it's also very hard to find your own personality, your own vision in the shadow of these great figures. And, you know, when you're a writer, you know, look around this library, you know, there's so many people who did it better than you did. There's so many people, and it can be so intimidating, but it also gives you that permission to maybe, you can be a little bit original. You just don't have to always overdo it.
Yeah. Well, we can get back to somebody who I think you do approve of, who is Fabritius, who's a pupil of Rembrandt's. He's famous for The Goldfinch. I think some of us have read that book. And I was struck most of all by how he died. Can you tell us about this?
Yeah.
He died while painting, and his
Yes.
model died too.
She's just, spoiler alert.
No, but I didn't say, sorry. But I didn't say how.
No, but I mean, I think a
Don't
lot of
ever
people,
ask me to tell a joke.
this is not an unknown,
Right.
you know, thing, because the link, there's a genealogy in Dutch painting, which I compare sort of, it's like a royal house, you know, and it goes from Rembrandt to Vermeer. And then there's Rembrandt's students, there's the students of Rembrandt's students. It goes on for almost 150 years, you know, that. But it climaxes, if we may.
You may.
Okay, with Vermeer, and the question of how they were connected, because they're obviously connected, was always a mystery until the late 19th century, really, when a French scholar who owned both the Goldfinch and two Vermeers just in his living room, Théophile Touré, who was a great critic and an excellent writer, and who really figured out what the Dutch school had been, and gave it some kind of coherence, figured out basically that Fabritius was a figure that links Vermeer to Rembrandt. And Fabritius was this very good-looking young guy. And there's two self-portraits of him. He's really attractive. He's really, like, you can see something in him fascinating. And he's this incredible painter, of which we only have 12 paintings. The reason, as Pamela alluded to, he was painting in his studio in Delft in 1654 when somebody idiotically took a flame, like a, what do you call it, a torch, into the municipal gunpowder depository. So this doesn't end well. I think it's something like it's something like 2/3 of the buildings of the city are either destroyed or damaged. It was a boom that could be heard. Is anyone here Dutch? No. It could be heard as far as Texel, which is the island, which is probably 70 kilometers north of Amsterdam, and Delft is probably 50 kilometers south of Amsterdam. So I mean, it was a massive explosion, and he was painting, and he died at age 32, which was unfortunately not that exceptional. I mean, these people died young.
Yeah. You talk about the quality of his painting, and you say it has a certain charisma, which is hard to put your finger on, but can you say a little bit about what that is, what that means for you?
Yeah, charisma is something I've always thought about because I've written biographies of women. My two books before this were biographies of Clarice Lispector and of Susan Sontag, who were always talked about in terms of their appearance. And people always, some people were offended by this, some people were turned on by this, it depends on the context. But I always looked at them and I tried to think, it's very hard to see in a photograph what makes somebody sexy, like what makes somebody charismatic, what makes somebody attractive. But you talk to anybody who knew these people and they say, oh, she walked into a room and everybody looked, and it's true. I mean, there are people that have this quality. And what also fascinates me is I was thinking about it in terms of photography with Sontag. Some people, a lot of models and actresses who are not necessarily, you look at them and you think, they're fine, they're okay, but like, boy, the lights go on and something happens. Yeah. They have some quality that it's not about like my nose is 3 centimeters this way and my eye, it's not that. Or like, I'm 2 kilos overweight or the things that people think. It's something that is actually, this is my conclusion, take it or leave it, but because I think we've all known people who, like, if you looked at them on a photograph, you would think, wow, like that is a beautiful guy. And then you talk to him and you're like, ugh.
And the paintings somehow have this quality.
Well, I think that the people who make paintings have that quality. And they're just as an actress can infuse something into a film, I think that artists can infuse something of their own soul into an artwork that you don't know what it is, but you feel it. You're like, why is this, and you see this like in still lifes is a good example.
You talk about this with flower paintings.
Flower painting.
Yeah.
Because like, it's a flower, I mean, it's fine, but like sometimes you feel something in a flower painting that is so extraordinary. And so listen, this is not verifiable. The fact checkers will not, but my theory is that you feel something of the person who made it.
Yeah. We could spend a lot of time on each of these, but I want to move on to Avercamp. Partly because I've seen so many of his paintings are all over. When you go to Amsterdam, he paints these wonderful winter scenes of children playing and people's ice skating, and it's kind of an idealized version of the Netherlands. And you, I don't think you discovered, but you show in your book that he was actually deaf and quite isolated in a way. And so this was him portraying this world that he couldn't necessarily participate in.
Well, that's the theory. That he was isolated because he was handicapped. The thing is about the 17th century is everybody was handicapped in some way. I mean, the number of diseases that we would have 20 minutes of going to the doctor and you'd get a shot and it would be over. That stuff killed people then, and lots of them.
Your book is just littered with women who died in childbirth and children who died
It's
young
littered with corpses. I'm warning you. It's
children, people who artists who got the plague.
Oh yeah, no.
Gave the plague to other.
Yeah, I mean it was a brutal time, and this was actually like the richest country in the world and the healthiest country in the world in some ways. So you think how everybody else lived in every other country.
But these scenes are very important because so he portrayed this famous race. It's an annual winter race where you would ice skate from town to town over kind of frozen rivers and canals and things.
Well, this is the great Dutch national tradition is winter skating. So I wrote about that. Actually, I wrote about that in the New York Times about 3 months ago. This sport is gone. Yeah. It is dead and gone. And I was writing about cultural heritage and how climate change is bringing cultural heritage losses. We always think about like Venice is going to be underwater or all these other things like that, but how it changes culture and how it changes how we go through life, how we experience our lives. It's different when you don't ever get to ice skate in Holland.
Yeah. I wanted to talk about Ter Borch just because you tell this, you tell these stories about him. You sort of piece together the few things we know about him. And you say the only way that all these things could have happened to this guy from a fairly humble background if he was an incredibly talented social climber. You kind of find the missing ingredient.
It's the only way. I mean, I think so now I'm 47, so I've been at this for a long time, and you see people all the time that you started off with when you were 22, and they were really smart, and they got better grades than you, and they were this and that, and nothing happens. They might have gotten this huge book contract when they were 25, and now by our age, you've never heard of them anymore, and so. I've always been really interested, also as a biographer, in what does it take to succeed as an artist? Yeah. And social climbing you can sneer at, but it's also the way that stuff gets done, because you can be a genius, but if you don't have the email address of the person at the New York Times, then your genius is going to go unsung.
Well, social climbing sounds negative, but you can also say the person is good at making connections, kind of.
Well, just moving through the world is a big part of any life. I think even if you're working at a pharmacy, if all your clients hate you, you're not going to do very well. But so Ter Borch though is interesting because he comes from this kind of small town, and there he is with the King of Spain, at age 22, and you think that must was how did that happen? And it's an interesting, but it's also part of this autobiographical reflection of myself of how do you succeed as an artist? There's all these ingredients. Charisma is one, connections or networking, whatever you want to call it.
Right.
There are negative words for it, but we all have to do it.
Right.
People have to like you.
Right.
Sadly.
Right.
But
So Borch also was what you describe as a genre painter, which means he didn't paint these grand biblical scenes or historical triumphs. He painted just people in everyday life.
Well, this is something really interesting. So he, the beginning of the modern novel is it 1606 is Don Quixote is considered the beginning. One generation later in Holland, not really in Spain. I mean, genre painting had existed in a way, but a novel is a book about anything, right? It could be about a love affair, which is the original meaning of what it is, but it can be about anything. You can talk in it. You can walk down the street. You can do anything. And the Dutch paint this. And Ter Borch is a great painter of just people doing stuff. Mm-hmm. So I kind of define genre painting as it could be in a novel. It could be a scene from a novel. Mm. So you could be receiving a letter, or you could be going out to dinner, or you could be talking in a library. Mm-hmm. That's the world of the genre. And
you can imagine a whole story behind it.
You can imagine the whole story, and you see the characters. And actually with Ter Borch, you actually know who the people are, because it's all his family.
Yeah. For the last painter I wanted to mention, it's Jan Steen. And you say that he excels at creating a mood, which he's also, would you say he's a genre painter as well? Yeah. So there are wonderful paintings reproduced in the book, and I wanted to talk about just one, the woman at the toilet, at her toilet. She's not actually on the toilet, she's doing she's getting undressed actually in bed. And you talk about how there's sort of this mixed message. There's a blend of kind of moralizing, but also sort of licentiousness. And I just want to quote from what you wrote, because it's so well told. And this was a painting that was sold to the King of England in 1821, so this was an important painting. Her look, she's sort of peeling off her socks. Come hither, not so fast. Consider the warnings lurking everywhere. There's a skull wrapped in a vine, for instance, and a lute with a broken string. You have to study the painting closely. You mentioned some other symbols in the painting. Grapevines, sunflowers, which are a traditional symbol for constancy. You say that the painter might be protecting himself, making sure that if ever summoned to the witness stand, he can defend his painting against charges of encouraging immorality. So he's unambiguously stated that you're not supposed to walk through this door because you see the woman through a wooden door. At the same time, as so often in Steen's work, the atmosphere says something quite different. He's warning you, and in no uncertain terms, not to head toward that, now that you mention it, extremely attractive, scantily clad and very welcoming young lady, the one who is slyly beckoning you to join her in her rumpled bed. Sleeping with her is a terrible idea, and don't even think about pouring yourself another drink. Any tedious preacher would remind you that life is fragile and pleasure's fleeting, but Steen's understanding of human character is far more subtle than that. In picture after picture, he appends a pro forma warning against vanity and vice, and then, knowing perfectly well that you're going to do it anyway, he winks. Oh, that was so great. I'll leave the picture out for afterward.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, Steen is the great master of the wink, you know. And actually, I love that chapter because I talk about Susan Sontag and Notes on Camp. Yeah. Because camp is, you know, according to Sontag, it's sort of an 18th century thing. It's the art of failed seriousness. It's the art of you know, obvious irony. But Steen does it 100 years before. And so he's actually one. I mentioned there were only two painters that never had to be rediscovered from 17th century Holland. Rembrandt was one and Steen was the other. And the reason is because the Dutch loved him. And his life story and his kind of zany antics enter the Dutch language. And we still use a lot of expressions that are related to Jan Steen today. So, yeah, he's somebody who kind of, yeah, he entered people's minds, also sort of in a Shakespearean way that people remember certain lines and they don't even know that they're from Shakespeare.
I would encourage you to read the book to learn more about the various artists, but I want to move on to a little bit about the writing itself. I have to say that I've known you for a long time and I've had a lot of conversations with you, but I was astonished by your literary vocabulary. It's not, I feel like as an American living abroad, I lose words all the time, but you seem to have gained words, I'm imagining. I just thought I'd read some of the words that I discovered in this book. And I should also say that none of them are used pretentiously. They're used to really precisely get at what you're trying to describe. Stagey, numinous, some of them are art words. Pentimenti, afflatus, mincing, tenebris, quisling, beribboned. Those are just men wearing ribbons, but I still thought it was cool. Craquelure, carbuncles, and I already said afflatus. That was my favorite one. So I have no idea what that means. I have to look it up. You know, you and I have both lived abroad for about the same amount of time, and I felt like I had had every thought about what it is to be a foreigner. But you really brought it to a new level, and maybe because you're in a place where there aren't so many Americans, where it isn't such a trodden path. And you write, in terms of watching the Dutch watch Americans, when I checked the Dutch newspapers, I was struck by how naive, how wrong much Dutch reporting on the United States sounded. Reading the things the Dutch wrote about us was like watching someone gaze upon a distant planet. Television, music, and instant communication didn't bring us closer as they seemed to. Instead, perversely, they ended up emphasizing how far away we really were. In order to understand what the Dutch thought about America, Americans were in a way irrelevant. What was relevant was what earlier Dutch writers and thinkers had said about America. And then you talk about the way we Americans see Europe. In the Holland I'd learned to see through the prism of the Golden Age artists was a country that had never quite existed. Yet it had a reality that was far more convincing than whatever other reality skulked behind those images. That reality, lost with the passing of the centuries, no longer mattered. Was this Europe? It was our Europe. Europeans seldom recognized it any more than we recognized their America. And then you admit something which I thought was very honest. As much as I could, I avoided the present. This is when you moved to the Netherlands. I lived in my own foreigner's Europe. I ignored politics, depressing in every country. I ignored news. I wriggled through prehistoric caves. I read old poems. I haunted ruins. I went to museums where I found a reality as real as any other. At least sometimes, at least for a few minutes, I could choose which reality to inhabit. I think we can all relate to that.
Well, I think as a foreigner, you can take and choose what you want. You can actually, I can't ignore that, like, Donald Trump is on trial and that, what's the guy's name? David Packer or whatever. Pecker.
It's better than
has
that.
like a new policy called catch and kill at the National Enquirer. I could close my eyes and bury myself in a coffin and I would still know everything that's happening in the US and care about it. The thing about being in somebody else's country is it just doesn't matter. Like, it does if you want it to, but it'll never have the same kind of emotional resonance. It'll never matter as much as, you know, like an American election will matter to me more than every other. Even though, why? It doesn't actually affect me. I mean, it kind of affects me, but like, it's only if I really focus on it. And I think one of the nice things about being a foreigner is that it is, it's an alienation in a certain way, but it's also a liberation. And you can choose what to see and what not to see in a way that's a lot harder in your own society.
Can we have a round of applause for that? Thank you both so much for this conversation. It was so rich. I feel like we all learned so much about both being abroad and actually art history as well. So thank you, Pamela, for the moderation. Thank you, Benjamin. And we now have time for questions. So we will start with our in-person audience. Raise your hand very high, and I will bring you the microphone. And then if we have time, we'll switch to Zoom as well.
Hi. You mentioned that it wasn't until you saw the early works of Vermeer that you realized that artists started from lower than you imagined them to do, but didn't you see that at Knopf when you saw manuscripts come in and get transformed into
That is a
books?
great question that I do not mention in this, but actually that in a way gave me the nerve to become a writer, because we would get all these things in from these famous people and I would read it and I was like, pfft. I mean, some of it, like with Naipaul, I would get these things and I would think there's no way I can ever do this. But with, I would say, a majority of them, even really good people, I was like, well, okay, I see what's happening here. You know what I mean?
Were they edited to become much better?
Sometimes, not all times. I mean, it was really like there's some of them are really bad and there's nothing you can do about it. And there's a contract and there's some agent being like, are we good for November 11th? You know, or something. And like, it's going to come out on November 11th and nobody can help it. And you just say, wow. And so that does give you a real self-confidence in a way that, I mean, it's not to say, I mean, it's not like every bad manuscript comes out at Knopf, right? Like, in order to get to Knopf and to have your bad manuscript be someone else's problem, that's where you want to get. You know, you want to make it someone else's problem. And it's something that, you know, when you study literary careers, I didn't mean to, really. I just started writing biographies, and, you know, then you start thinking about, like in Clarice Lispector's case, this destitute Jewish near orphan comes from nothing. I mean, dirt poor in a country that's poor, or often poor, and it's not like a country where everybody reads, Brazil, you know, and this girl from nowhere becomes this great artist. Like, how does that happen? So all those questions, and it also gives you a real tolerance for people's failures, because when you look at a whole work, which is rare, you know, you don't, even like at a museum when you see retrospective, they have taken out a lot of stuff so that you think, wow, Pamela Druckerman, you know, a genius. Like her, you know, and that's like actually her late phase, you know, they've edited it out for you. But, you know, I think that failures often lead to success. If you're lucky, something that you've tried and maybe didn't work, well, the thinking about that, the process of it leads you to something more successful in the next round.
But is the classic trajectory there that you have the early work where the person's figuring out what their style is, then you have the great work, and then they sort of rest on their laurels and it gets worse?
Well, no, I mean, like, sometimes it's, you know, so like in the cases of Rembrandt or Frans Hals, for example, it gets better and it gets crazier and it gets more free, because they're like, I'm 80. Right. I'm a genius. I'm putting the hand over here. Right. You know what I mean? And it actually is 3 meters away from the body. But there's something, no, I think there's not really a trajectory in artists' lives. I think that people do things at certain times and for certain reasons that are successful, and at other times they're not successful. But I think the real artist, I mean, this is one of the questions in the book as well, is how far do you have to go? You know, do you have to go like Rembrandt, where he's basically dies with his brush in his hand? Or can you stop? Can you paint one great painting, and is that enough to be an artist?
Other questions in the room? The Zoom audience needs the microphone. The audience on Zoom needs the microphone.
Just a quick thought. What did Rembrandt get sued for? Multiple times. Were there law firms then? Or
No.
what was
Spoiler alert. Part
Sorry.
2.
Okay, sorry.
No, he got sued basically about, not delivering art is one thing, and the other thing was women. Basically, yeah, basically, but worse. Yeah.
He hired a maid to look after his mistress, and then he had an affair with the maid. Was that it?
No, he hired him to look after his kid.
Ah.
And then he started sleeping with her and said he would marry her, and then did not marry her and locked her up in a madhouse.
Yeah.
She did. Well, I mean, that's how she got in the madhouse. Yeah, it wasn't a great thing. But, it's really interesting to be writing this during the age of Me Too and all this, because you think, like, what does an artist have to be? Like, does an artist have to have a perfect life? Does an artist have to be this exemplary person? We all know they're often not, just like any other person, but since artists are often extreme characters, they're more extreme.
I'll just quickly interject here as we're rapidly running out of time and selfishly take some of the Q&A time for myself. As you're speaking about what an artist has to be, I'm struck that we haven't really learned how you arrived at the practice of biography. And I'm wondering if you could speak more about your role as a biographer and how that fed into this book.
Well, I mean, this is slightly biographical, but it's also more autobiographical in a way than I've done before. No, I started because I fell in love with Clarice Lispector when I was in college for a long reason that we don't have to go into. And I wanted to do something to bring her into the world outside of Brazilian literature and into the wider world where she deserved to be as one of the greatest modern writers. And I thought a biography was an interesting way to do it because you could tell a story of who this person was. And then I hoped that through that, she would be discovered and her books would be read and translated. And that's what happened. So, and then I just kind of liked it. I'm just really interested in these questions because it's all about, I think the artist's question is almost always how to survive. How do you survive? And you see how dangerous it is when you look at even great artists and how difficult their lives have been. And you think, like, your mother was right. Like, don't do it. Go to law school. But then on the other hand, I think, a life engaged with aesthetic questions and with thought and mind and art, it's the most rewarding life there is. And so that's why we're still around, still hitting our heads against the wall.
But don't you think the struggle sort of drives you forward too, even if you make some missteps?
Of course. Yeah. Well, that's the thing about errors and bad works and lesser works and stuff.
But even the material struggle too, I mean, to just
Yeah. Because otherwise
yourself.
you would just like go to Mallorca and like order a pina colada, but actually like I think my theory is that the artist personality, the real artist, is not a restful person. It's not someone who's like going to take the rest of the day off. There's a quote in my Sontag book. It's Elias Canetti says, I try to imagine someone saying to Shakespeare, relax,
But also Rembrandt is never going to look at the great painting he did a month ago and think I'm done. That's just not the nature.
No. I'm checking into like, Club Med in St. Lucia with like 3 meals a day. Right. No, that's not how it works. And that's the art. That's the artist's personality.
We have a question on Zoom as well from Catherine Mulholland, who's used a word that I don't know how to pronounce, so I'm going to do my best. She's asked, what was the knell of death for the Dutch Golden Age in painting, and why did it all end?
The death knell, you would
Thank
say.
you
Although
very
in
much.
Dutch, just to come up for Dutch pronunciation, you would say knell, because you would always say
That
the
was why I
k
pronounced it
and the
that way, actually. It was
Yeah.
deliberate on my
In
behalf.
Dutch, you can do multiple consonants that don't really belong together, according to other people. There's no death knell. This is a really interesting question. Actually, there's this idea that the Dutch Golden Age traditionally ends in 1672, which is when France and England, along with a confederation of German states, invades the Netherlands, destroys the country, and pretty much bankrupts it for a generation, and some artists immigrate. some artists, like Franz Vermeer moves in with his mother-in-law. I mean, it was a it was a rough time, and also they destroyed all the estates. And Louis XIV actually ransacked a lot of the famous Dutch estates and brought the art to Paris. A less illustrious moment in collection history of the city, but that's how there's a lot of that stuff is here. And that idea was that it was all over then. It actually isn't over then at all. I mean, my book is about the 17th century just because I had to end it at some point, and Pamela thought it was too long anyway, so I had to cut. But actually 18th century Dutch painting is fabulous, and also 18th century Dutch decorative arts are incredibly illustrious, and it's not the kind of art that has as many famous names attached to it. But if you go to Holland and you visit 18th century houses, they're absolutely beautiful. There were lots and lots of artists, and that goes all the way to today. I mean, that goes all the way through the 19th century, the 20th century, and into today. It was always a country with great visual art.
Can we have a final round of applause for Benjamin and Pamela, please?
Thank you.